If you've ever stood in front of your grapevine in late winter, pruning shears in hand, and thought, I have no idea what I'm supposed to cut, you're not alone. Grape pruning is one of the most intimidating tasks in the entire garden. And honestly, I think it's because grapes look so different from everything else we grow. All those tangled canes going every direction, and you're supposed to cut most of it off. It feels wrong. But here's the thing. Once you understand how grapes actually grow and produce fruit, pruning becomes not just manageable, but genuinely satisfying. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the complete process of pruning grapes for maximum yield and long-term plant health. We'll cover timing, the tools you need, how to identify exactly what to cut, the actual pruning process step by step, and different training systems you can use. Plus, stick around to the end, because I'm going to show you a simple summer pruning technique that most people skip, and it makes a huge difference in fruit quality. Let's get into it. Grapevines are one of the most rewarding plants you can grow in your home garden. They're long-lived, often producing for 50 years or more. They're beautiful on an arbor or trellis. And of course, the fruit is incredible. Whether you're eating it fresh, making juice, or even trying your hand at wine. The good news is that while grape pruning looks complicated, it follows a clear logic once you understand the basics. And that's exactly where we need to start, with understanding how grapevines actually grow and where the fruit comes from. So before we make a single cut, we need to talk about vine anatomy, because this is what makes grape pruning click. When you look at a mature grapevine, you're going to see several distinct parts, and knowing what each one does is essential. First, you have the trunk. This is the main permanent structure of the vine, the thick woody part that comes up out of the ground. The trunk doesn't change much from year to year. It just gets a little thicker over time. Coming off the trunk, you have what are called arms or cordons, depending on how you've trained your vine. These are also permanent or semi-permanent woody structures that extend horizontally or at angles from the trunk. Now here's where it gets important. Growing off those arms, you have canes. Canes are the long shoots that grew during the previous season. They started out green and flexible in spring and summer, and by winter they've turned brown and woody. These canes are what produced leaves and possibly fruit last year. And here's the key thing to understand. The buds on last year's canes are what will produce this year's fruit. Let me say that again, because it's the single most important concept in grape pruning. Grapes produce fruit on new growth that emerges from buds on one-year-old wood. Not the old thick wood, not brand new green shoots. The canes that grew last season hold the buds that will push out fruiting shoots this season. So when you're pruning, you're essentially selecting which of last year's canes you want to keep to produce this year's crop. Everything else gets removed. You'll also see spurs on some vines. A spur is just a cane that's been cut back very short, usually to 2 or 3 buds. Some training systems use spurs, others use longer canes. We'll get into that. And finally, you'll notice older wood that's several years old and much thicker than one-year-old canes. This old wood generally doesn't produce fruit and is often removed to keep the vine from getting too sprawling. Now let's talk about when to prune, because timing matters quite a bit with grapes. The ideal window for grape pruning is late winter to very early spring, while the vine is still fully dormant. For most of the country, that means somewhere between late January and early March, depending on your climate. In warmer zones like 8, 9, and 10, you might prune as early as January. In colder zones like 4, 5, and 6, you'll want to wait until late February or even into March, after the worst of the cold has passed, but before the buds start to swell. Why dormant pruning? A few reasons. First, it's much easier to see the structure of the vine when there are no leaves in the way. You can clearly identify the trunk, the arms, last year's canes, and any dead or damaged wood. Second, pruning during dormancy minimizes stress on the plant. The vine isn't actively growing, so it's not losing energy when you make cuts. And third, if you prune too late after the buds have started pushing, You'll knock off a lot of those tender new shoots and lose potential fruit. One thing I'll mention is that grapes are what we call bleeders. When you make cuts in late winter, you'll often see sap dripping from the wounds. This looks alarming the first time you see it, but it's completely normal and doesn't harm the vine. It's just a sign that the roots are starting to wake up and push moisture through the plant. Don't let it worry you. Before you head out to the vineyard, let's make sure you have the right tools, because this makes the job much easier and cleaner. For most home grape pruning, you really only need 2 tools. First, a sharp pair of bypass pruning shears. Bypass shears have 2 curved blades that slide past each other like scissors, giving you a clean cut. Avoid anvil-style pruners for grapes because they tend to crush the wood rather than slicing it cleanly. For canes up to about 1/2 inch in diameter, hand pruners are all you need. Second, for thicker cuts, you'll want a pair of loppers. These are basically larger pruners with long handles for leverage. Loppers let you cut through canes and old wood up to about 1.5 inches in diameter. If you have a really old, overgrown vine with very thick wood, you might also need a pruning saw, but that's usually only for renovation pruning on neglected vines. One more thing. Before you start cutting, take 30 seconds to clean your tools with rubbing alcohol or a 10% bleach solution. This is especially important if you're pruning multiple vines, because you don't want to spread any disease from one plant to another. I keep a rag soaked in rubbing alcohol in my back pocket and give the blades a quick wipe between vines. Now we get to the heart of it. How do you look at a tangled grapevine and know what to cut and what to keep? This is where people get stuck, so let's break it down clearly. Start by stepping back and looking at the overall structure of the vine. Identify the trunk first. That's your anchor point, the permanent vertical structure. Then find the arms, or cordons, the permanent horizontal pieces coming off the trunk. Everything growing off those arms is what we're evaluating. Now look at the canes, the long shoots that grew last year. You're looking for canes that are about pencil thickness, roughly 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch in diameter. Canes that are too thin, like skinny little whips, don't have enough stored energy to produce good fruit. Canes that are too thick, fatter than your thumb, tend to be overly vigorous and don't fruit as well either. That pencil thickness sweet spot is what you want. You also want to look at the spacing of the buds along the cane. Ideally, the buds should be spaced about 3 to 4 inches apart. If the buds are crammed close together, the cane grew in stressful conditions. If they're spaced very far apart, 8 inches or more, the cane was overly vigorous. Moderate bud spacing indicates healthy, balanced growth, and that's what produces the best fruit. Next, look at the color and condition of the wood. Healthy 1-year-old canes are tan or light brown with a slightly reddish tinge on some varieties. They should look plump and alive, not shriveled or gray. If you scratch the surface with your thumbnail, you should see green tissue underneath. Dead or damaged canes will be gray, shriveled, and show brown tissue when scratched. Here's a useful way to think about it. You're going to remove roughly 80 to 90% of last year's growth. I know that sounds extreme. It feels extreme the first few times you do it. But grapes are incredibly vigorous, and they need hard pruning to produce quality fruit. If you leave too much wood, the vine puts its energy into growing lots of leaves and small clusters of mediocre grapes. If you prune correctly, the vine focuses that energy into fewer but much higher quality clusters. So what you're doing is selecting the best canes, the ones with good thickness, healthy color, and proper bud spacing, and removing everything else. You're keeping the winners and firing everyone else, to borrow that analogy. One more thing to identify before cutting. Look for any dead arms or sections of the permanent structure that are no longer producing good canes. Sometimes an arm will die back part way or stop pushing new growth. These can be removed back to healthy wood. Also look for any canes growing in weird directions, like straight up into the air or down toward the ground, or canes that are crossing and rubbing against each other. These are candidates for removal even if they otherwise look healthy, because they'll create a tangled mess and airflow problems later. All right, let's actually start cutting. I'm going to walk you through the basic process, and then we'll talk about different training systems and how they modify this approach. First, remove all the obvious dead wood. Work your way around the vine and cut out anything that's clearly dead, gray, shriveled, or diseased. This is the easy stuff. Get it out of the way first so you can see the living structure more clearly. Next, remove any suckers growing from the base of the trunk or from the roots. These are vigorous shoots that sap energy from the productive part of the vine. Cut them off flush with the trunk, or dig down slightly to remove them from the root if needed. You'll also want to remove any shoots growing directly from the trunk below the arms, unless you're trying to establish a new arm in that location. Now focus on the arms. This is where training system matters, but the general principle is the same. You're selecting a limited number of the best canes from last year's growth and removing everything else. For each arm, you typically want to keep 1 or 2 canes depending on your training system and the vigor of your vine. Let's say you're keeping 2 canes per arm. Choose the 2 best canes based on the criteria we talked about: pencil thickness, healthy color, good bud spacing, and positioned where you want growth to occur. Cut these canes back to somewhere between 8 and 15 buds each, depending on the vigor of your vine and your training system. More vigorous vines can support more buds. Weaker vines should be pruned harder, leaving fewer buds. Now here's an important detail. When you make your cuts, cut about 1 inch above a bud, angling the cut slightly away from the bud so water runs off rather than sitting on top of it. A clean cut heals faster and reduces disease risk. Everything else on that arm, all the other canes, gets removed completely. Cut them back to the arm, leaving just a tiny stub of about 1/4 inch. This is where it feels brutal. You're taking off so much wood, but trust the process. Those remaining 8 to 15 buds on each selected cane are going to push out vigorous new shoots this spring, and each of those shoots can produce 2 or 3 clusters of grapes. Work your way around the entire vine, arm by arm, selecting and shortening your keeper canes and removing everything else. When you're done, the vine should look dramatically cleaner and more open than when you started. You should be able to see through the vine easily, and the remaining canes should have room to grow without crowding each other. Now let's talk about training systems, because how you've structured your vine affects exactly how you apply these principles. The 2 most common training systems for home gardeners are the 4-arm Niffen system and the bilateral cordon system. They're both excellent, and which one you use often depends on what kind of trellis you have and what type of grape you're growing. The 4-arm Niffen system uses a 2-wire trellis with wires at about 3 feet and 6 feet high. The vine's trunk grows up to the top wire, and you maintain 4 canes total. 2 trained along the top wire going in opposite directions, and 2 trained along the bottom wire going in opposite directions. Each year, you select 4 new canes from near the trunk and tie them along the wires, removing last year's canes entirely. This system works especially well for American grape varieties like Concord and Niagara. The bilateral cordon system is a bit different. Here, you establish 2 permanent horizontal arms, called cordons, running along a single wire, usually about 3 to 4 feet high. Rather than replacing the entire arm each year, you keep those cordons in place and prune to short spurs along their length. Each spur gets cut back to 2 or 3 buds, and those buds produce this year's fruiting shoots. This system is common for wine grapes and works well in many situations. Both systems accomplish the same basic goal: limiting the amount of fruiting wood to what the vine can support while keeping the structure organized and manageable. If you're just starting out and your vine is on a simple arbor or fence, don't stress too much about having a perfect system. Focus on the fundamentals. Keep limited amounts of healthy 1-year-old wood, remove everything else, and maintain good airflow through the canopy. By the way, if you're finding this helpful, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more videos like this. All right, let's keep going. Let's talk about common problems and mistakes, because there are a few things that trip people up with grape pruning. The most common mistake by far is not pruning hard enough. I see this all the time. People feel bad removing so much growth, so they leave way too many canes or leave the canes too long with too many buds. The result is a vine that produces tons of small sour grapes that never ripen properly, because the plant is spreading its energy too thin. Remember, 80 to 90% of last year's growth gets removed. It looks harsh, but it's what the plant needs. The second mistake is pruning at the wrong time. Pruning too early in fall while the vine is still active can stimulate new growth that gets killed by winter cold. Pruning too late in spring after the buds have pushed damages those tender new shoots and costs you fruit. Stick to that late winter dormant window. Third, people sometimes get confused about which wood produces fruit and accidentally remove all the one-year-old canes while keeping old, unproductive wood. Remember, fruit comes from new shoots that grow out of buds on last year's canes. If you remove all the one-year-old wood, you've removed all your fruiting potential for the season. Fourth, poor cuts can cause problems. Ragged cuts from dull pruners heal slowly and invite disease. Cuts made too close to a bud can damage it. Cuts made too far from a bud leave a long stub that dies back and looks ugly. Clean cuts about an inch above a bud, angled slightly, are what you're after. Fifth, neglecting to thin the canopy during the growing season. We'll talk about this more in a moment, but summer pruning matters too. If you do a great job with dormant pruning and then let the vine turn into a jungle all summer, you'll still have problems with disease, poor ripening, and reduced fruit quality. And finally, not matching your pruning to your vine's vigor. A young, weak vine should be pruned harder, leaving fewer buds so it can focus energy on getting established. A mature, vigorous vine can support more buds. If your vine is producing lots of skinny canes with tight bud spacing, it's telling you it was stressed last year, maybe from overproduction. Prune harder this year to bring it back into balance. Now, dormant pruning is the main event, but summer maintenance pruning plays an important supporting role that a lot of gardeners skip. Once your vine starts growing in spring, it's going to push out a lot of new shoots. Some of these are productive shoots that will bear fruit. Others are non-fruiting shoots or suckers that are just taking energy away from grape production. Throughout the growing season, especially in early summer, walk through and remove suckers from the trunk and base, as well as any shoots growing from old wood that aren't going to produce fruit. You also want to manage the canopy by positioning shoots so they're not all piled on top of each other. On a trellis system, this usually means tucking shoots up between catch wires so they grow vertically and allow air and light to reach the fruit zone. Good airflow reduces disease pressure dramatically. Some growers also do what's called hedging, where you trim the tops of the shoots once they've grown past the top of the trellis. This keeps things tidy and redirects energy back into the fruit. Just don't overdo it. The leaves are producing the sugars that sweeten your grapes, so you need to keep a healthy canopy. Now for that bonus tip I promised. This is something I do every year that really improves fruit quality, and most home gardeners never think to do it. It's called cluster thinning. About 2 to 3 weeks after bloom, once the tiny grapes have set and you can see the clusters starting to develop, go through and remove some of them. For table grapes, I typically remove about a third of the clusters, keeping the ones that are best positioned and best shaped. For wine grapes, some people remove even more to really concentrate flavors. This feels counterintuitive. You're literally throwing away future grapes. But here's what happens. The remaining clusters get more energy from the vine. The grapes size up better, ripen more evenly, and develop better sugar levels and flavor. You end up with a smaller quantity of genuinely delicious grapes rather than a larger quantity of mediocre ones. I started doing this about 5 years ago, and the difference in eating quality is remarkable. The grapes are sweeter, juicier, and ripen a good week earlier than when I let the vine carry every cluster it sets. It takes maybe 15 minutes to walk through and thin the clusters, and it's absolutely worth it. So that's everything you need to know to prune your grapevines with confidence. We covered timing, tools, understanding what to cut. the actual pruning process, training systems, common mistakes to avoid, and summer maintenance. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. And if you have any great pruning tips of your own or questions about your specific situation, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.